Good morning, or whatever the hell it is. Thanks for tuning in to the Housing Revolution video series. Hopefully you've seen the first two intro videos. Now we're getting into the meat and potatoes of it all. So here's part one, chapter one, feudalism and the founding fathers' big conflict. So what does feudalism have to do with housing? Well, when you get outside of the housing box, away from the incessant arguments about supply, regulations, zoning, NIMBYs, and government housing, away from the people just need to be paid a living wage arguments, you see that the feudalism at the foundation of our housing system, while rarely discussed, is one of the deepest roots of our dysfunctional land and housing system. While it's not the classic feudalism our founding fathers reviled, it's the new feudalism, the feudalism 2.0 they inadvertently put in place. So I've got a really cool document here. James Madison, often considered the principal architect of our democracy, of the structure of our federal government, and of the Constitution, was, like the other founding fathers, conflicted when it came to feudalism and the rights of landowners. The cool thing is, he knew he was conflicted, and he spoke about it at the Constitutional Convention. So this document summarizes the conflict. This document is James Madison's notes on one of his speeches at the Constitutional Convention, a speech on property rights, personal rights, and who should have the right to vote. But before we get into this document, here's a quick breakdown of feudalism. It was the dominant social system for many centuries in medieval Europe. Though there were many variations, in a nutshell, the crown controlled large regions of land. These regions were in turn controlled by representatives of the crown known as nobility or lords, and they were charged with the task of protecting these regions. In order to field a band of warriors to protect these regions, lords would give control of tracts of land to vassals on the condition the vassals would in return fight to protect the lord's land whenever called upon to do so. At the bottom of the pecking order, the peasants were then allowed to farm the land in exchange for labor and/or a portion of the crops they grew. Typically, the peasants, despite their hard work, were left with just enough to sustain themselves. Most of their excess went to the vassals and lords. Now, the founding fathers hated feudalism. They felt, rightly so, that it was oppressive. Looking forward, they felt a system without feudalism in which laborers got to keep the fruits of their own labors would encourage productivity, or industry as they called it, and would lead to a thriving, self-sustaining country. They felt that private land ownership, where those working the land owned that same land, would accomplish this goal, as laborers would no longer have to surrender their labor and/or the fruits of their labors to the landowners. They would then be able to build wealth, which in turn would encourage productivity from these labor landowners. But there was a problem. The founding fathers were now the big landowners themselves and were frightened of the prospects of the non-landowners one day becoming the majority and voting to take away landowners' land. So, with that said, let's get into this document. I will put a link to this document in the comments below, as well as a link giving some info on the note-taking process at the Constitutional Convention. So right off the bat, Madison states the conflict. The right of suffrage is a fundamental article in Republican constitutions, which translates to the right to vote is fundamental in a nation governed by the people. He goes on, the regulation of it is, at the same time, a task of peculiar delicacy. Okay, so making this happen is a lot harder and nuanced than it seems. He says, allow the right exclusively to property, and the rights of persons may be oppressed. The feudal polity alone sufficiently proves it. In other words, give the right to vote only to the landowners, and the rights of non-landowners are likely to be oppressed, which we know was the case with feudalism. Madison goes on, extend it equally to all, and the rights of property or the claims of justice may be overruled by a majority without property or interested in measures of injustice. In other words, give everyone the right to vote, and the majority may take away the right to own land or may engage in other means of injustice. He goes on, in civilized communities, property as well as personal rights is an essential object of the laws, which encourage industry by securing the enjoyment of its fruits. In other words, in civilized societies, the rights of landowners to own their land as well as personal rights like religion, free speech, etc., are essential objectives of law, which encourage productivity by ensuring the rewards of productivity of labors are kept by the producers, by the laborers, not extorted away by the feudal landlords. Madison goes on to pose the question, how do we ensure both the property rights of landowners as well as the personal rights of all citizens as long as they are adult white males? He then makes the case that between landowners' rights and personal rights, landowners' rights are the more vulnerable. He says that while landowners may be in the majority at present, the day will likely come when landowners are in the minority. He poses the question of how to protect the rights of landowners when the non-landowners become the majority. He says, and whenever the majority shall be without landed or other equivalent property and without the means or hope of acquiring it, what is to secure the rights of property against the danger from an equality and universality of suffrage, vesting complete power over property in the hands without a share in it? Again, in modern vernacular, he is scared that those without land and or without the hope of acquiring land will one day be in the majority and will legislate away the land of those who do own land. In the next paragraph, he makes the case that ample protections be put in place to protect the property rights of landowners. Listen carefully. He says, as the soil becomes subdivided and actually cultivated by the owners, this view of the subject derives force from the principle of natural law, which vests in individuals an exclusive right to the portions of ground with which they have incorporated their labor and improvements. Did you catch that extremely consequential qualifier in there? In other words, these protections should be extended to those landowners who are actually cultivating and making improvements to the land, bringing the land to its potential, and should protect only the portions of land they are laboring and improving. He makes no mention about providing protections to land that a landowner is not laboring, that he owns in excess of his own personal needs and is using merely to charge rents to others in need of land. This qualifier was by no means warranting any version of feudalism, old or new. And while out of context interpretations of this qualifier surely will be cited in support of modern day landlords and real estate investors, as soon as this qualifier is put into context, such as with the line from above that says, in civilized communities, property rights are an essential object of laws, which encourage industry by securing the enjoyment of its fruits, these interpretations are exposed as fabrications propagated to maintain the status quo, to maintain our unjust property and housing laws. As we'll see in another video later this week, this paragraph and this qualifier are very similar to Abraham Lincoln's views about how much land one person or business should be able to own. So in summary so far, James Madison felt the Constitution should have ample protections for the property rights of landowners as well as the personal rights of landowners and non-landowners alike. He felt a balance must be struck so that property protections of landowners are securely in place but do not oppress the non-landowners. He also, at one point, includes the never talked about qualifier that the property protections afforded landowners should be extended only to the land that landowners are actually cultivating, and makes no mention of universally extending these protections to land holdings that aren't being cultivated, labored on, or improved upon. So the remainder of this document talks about potential means of striking this balance. The first three are: 1, giving the right to vote only to landowners; 2, having two separate houses of legislation, one to exclusively represent landowners and one to exclusively represent non-landowners; 3, having two separate houses of legislation, one house to represent personal rights of everyone, landowners and non-landowners alike, and another house exclusively representing landowners and their property rights exclusively. Well, all three of these were rejected or dismissed by Madison. The fourth, however, seems to be a prototype for the Senate and House of Representatives we now have, with Madison's reasoning that representation in one house by large regions with longer terms, such as the Senate we have today, would by nature protect the property rights of landowners. So take the link and read for yourself. So what does all of this have to do with the state of today's housing? Well, when all was said and done, the Founding Fathers' big conflict between avoiding the oppressive aspects of feudalism and protecting the property rights of landowners was settled in favor of themselves, the landowners. Strong protections with no qualifiers for the property rights of landowners were put in place. Qualifications for these protections, such as requiring landowners to be actually laboring on and making improvements to their land, vanished into thin air. Nor were there any limits placed on the amount of land one person could own. Nor were there any restrictions about charging rents to others to work and or live on the land. The underlying mechanism of the feudalism the Founding Fathers so reviled was left firmly in place. That underlying mechanism, a person or group of people controlling more land than needed for their own personal use and then charging rents to the non-landowners in need of land, transcended the Constitution and has undermined the Founding Fathers' vision for our country. As long as one had the means, one could control as much land as one wanted, wherever one wanted, and could rent that land out to those in need of land at whatever rates the market would bear. One could buy land on speculation, hold it without utilizing it for as long as one wanted, enabling the owner to one day sell it for a profit, despite the fact that the amount of effort the owner put into it was in no way commensurate with the profits he made upon selling, and despite the fact that society was then deprived of the benefits this land would have delivered had it been sufficiently utilized. The Founding Fathers, with their failure to put in place any restrictions on the amount of land an individual could own, and their failure to put in place James Madison's requirements in order for landowners to receive property protections, paved the way for the new feudalism, Feudalism 2.0. While they made sure the old feudalism via the crown, the nobility, or even the government, would never resurface, they inadvertently laid down the red carpet for feudalism via private citizen and eventually via private corporation to proliferate. The scope of this new feudalism has expanded far beyond solely agriculture, as it is at play in most commercial land and structures and is rampant in housing. It's in play in leased land and housing, as well as land and housing bought on speculation and sold for unearned profits. It is the means by which those controlling excess land and housing are enabled to continue the extorting of the fruits of workers' labors that the Founding Fathers found so oppressive. It has continued a system in which one class, the asset class, is enabled to generate wealth not by laboring or producing, not by making a positive contribution to the citizenry, but merely by controlling a vital resource and taking advantage of laws of supply and demand and inflation, while laborers are then forced to labor not only enough to meet the needs of their own sustenance, but the excessive amounts then required to generate wealth for those controlling the land. This Feudalism 2.0 would have been destructive enough on its own, but as we will see next week, Feudalism 2.0, working in concert with our hyperinflationary mortgage system, is what has brought our housing system to the currently grossly dysfunctional state it is in. Despite all the talk about the lack of housing supply and people not getting paid living wages, the dynamics created by feudalism working in concert with our hyperinflationary mortgage system are the deepest roots of our land and housing crisis. This result was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before we arrived at this point. And until we effectively and comprehensively annihilate these deepest roots, all of our well-intended but misguided attempts to address our affordable land and housing crisis will continue on in a never-ending circle of futility. Next week, we will be talking in depth about our hyperinflationary mortgage system, the hows and whys it has taken a bad thing, feudalism, and exponentially expanded its negative effects. I hope you will be there. I will break down some vital economic concepts in a way that any and everyone will comprehend them and will begin to understand how these concepts are affecting their everyday lives, and will begin to recognize these concepts at play in their everyday lives. It is so important to arm yourselves with this information because the economy has been weaponized by those who understand economics, have the means to exploit the economy, and are able to influence economic policy. Failing to understand the economic strategies of those who have the insatiable need to economically repress and dominate others is basically rolling over and saying, hey, go ahead, have at it. Meanwhile, on tap this week are some great passages from Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln on land. While Jefferson had the foresight to see the potential for the new feudalism, Lincoln saw it 80 years later as it was manifesting, and he witnessed its destructive effects. Both offered solutions that, similar to Madison's criteria for property protections, had we followed, would have resulted in our land and housing system being much more equitable, functional, affordable, and available today. So, see you in the next video, and don't forget to lick the hype button, subscribe, and always hit the No Box Donations tab, because it really helps with the YouTube algorithm, blah, blah, blah. All right, over and out. See you tomorrow.